The Marvel Cinematic Universe. If I could go back and talk to my pre-adolescent self about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I would probably say, what are you talking about, and is that really your hairline? It might be a little hard to comprehend, but the MCU has only been a thing for about a decade and a half, since Iron Man in 2008, even though it feels like it's been around since the Byzantine Empire. Sure, there were other Marvel movies before that, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, a Hulk movie we try to forget, and a Daredevil film that is in no way problematic or cringe. But the sprawling, seemingly unending Marvel franchise that we refer to as the MCU really kicked off with Iron Man, and boy, has a lot changed in the 14 years since. Before I really get into the meat of this video, let me just say that I was a fan of the MCU back in the days of my youth. I'm not a comic book guy, but I was a fan of the movies, and I even had a Captain America shirt that was very comfortable and didn't hurt my overly sensitive nipples. Now, I'm not shitting on the MCU because I think comic book movies or superhero movies are dumb by any means. I love Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Logan, and many Batman movies. I even saw Spider-Man No Way Home because watching Peter meet Peter while doing Spidey things with Peter gives me goosebumps. The subject matters of the movies are not the issue. There are many issues I have, and they all stem from one place. I'll get into each issue I have, but first let me break down the timeline. It's 2008. I'm 12 years old and dressing like a character from Blue's Clues. Iron Man bursts onto the scene and blows everyone's socks off. Thus bursts the creation that will eventually overpower its creator and become an unstoppable force that causes low-level YouTubers to make videos complaining about it. And 1 month later, Big Green Guy Go Smash, the remake. 2010, the universally disliked Iron Man 2, Electric Boogaloo. 2011, Thor. The one thing I remember about Thor is that there are so many canted angles that I thought I was watching an episode of Batman the series. Later in 2011, Captain America, the First Avenger. It might surprise you, but I actually like this movie more than most people do, even though some of the shots look like Baz Luhrmann got a hold of it after doing 12 shots of Vegemite and just went hog wild. I should clarify that Baz Luhrmann is not the director of Captain America. Some of the shots just look like The Great Gatsby, and not in a good way. Now 2012, the event that got everyone to collectively lose their minds for about a month or so. The Avengers. Now, it might seem pretty routine and mundane in today's world, but back then it was crazy to see all your favorite superheroes together on screen, unless you count the animated Justice League show and the original Teen Titans, which are both criminally underrated, I might add. Conversely, I feel like people now agree that Avengers was pretty overrated at the time, and the movie's actually just fine. 2013, Iron Man 3. Now, I saw this movie at midnight on opening night, back when that was still a thing. Now, I actually think this movie gets a lot of unnecessary hate, and maybe it's just because I'm not a comic book guy and I'm just a casual viewer. Is it great? No, but it was fine.
It was pretty good. It was all right. It wasn't great, but it was fine.
Later in 2013, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. starts, and I actually watched a few seasons of this, and then I got bored and stopped. Even later in 2013, Thor: The Dark World. And genuinely, I don't remember a goddamn thing about this movie.
I'm so confused.
I didn't watch it when it came out, and I think I've only seen it once, and that was on a tiny little screen in a dorm room 2 years after it was released. But I remember people giving it a lot of grief, and for good reason, because Thor's pretty lame.
It's fucking lonely. I'm all apart.
2014, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. This is when the Russo brothers got involved, and I think the MCU really hits its stride. I'm a huge fan of theirs from their work on Community, and I think without them, the MCU wouldn't have sustained its popularity for so long. And then later in 2014, Guardians of the Galaxy. James Gunn has this very unique style, and he brings kind of a freshness to the MCU that I think was desperately needed. And the soundtrack slaps. 2015, Agent Carter. I saw a couple episodes of this, and I saw enough to tell you definitively that this show is not good. And later in 2015, the first season of Daredevil premieres on Netflix. Now this is an odd one, because it was originally not affiliated with the MCU, but was retroactively made part of the MCU after the show's run. But either way, Daredevil is the best Marvel show that they've ever made, and Charlie Cox is a demigod. And around the same time in 2015, Avengers: Age of Ultron. And I think we can all agree that this is a pretty disappointing Avengers movie. Later in 2015, Ant-Man. Paul Rudd is Paul Rudd, so I'll always like him. The movie's decent. Later in 2015, Jessica Jones premieres on Netflix. And all of the Netflix Marvel shows are retroactively made part of the universe, so I'll stop saying it, but I enjoyed season 1 of this, and then I stopped watching at the beginning of season 2. 2016, Captain America Civil War. The Russo brothers are back and are single-handedly saving the MCU. Later in 2016, Luke Cage. I didn't finish the first season. Even later in 2016, Doctor Strange. It was alright. Now buckle up, because 2017 has so much. Iron Fist. I never watched it. I heard it was hot dung though. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. It still had a lot of the charm and characteristics that made the first one fun. I enjoyed it. Spider-Man Homecoming. I liked it. I have a soft spot for Spidey, if you couldn't tell. The Defenders. Didn't watch it. Inhumans? If I'm being honest, I don't even have a recollection of this being a thing. Thor Ragnarok. Honestly, I thought this movie was extremely overrated. Better than the first 2 Thor movies for sure, and I've grown to like Taika Waititi a lot, but this movie just doesn't do it for me. I will get into that more later, but for now, that's it. The Punisher. I like The Punisher. Runaways? It sounds made up. Okay, on to 2018. Black Panther. It was okay. Avengers Infinity War. I actually think this is probably my favorite Marvel movie. Cloak and Dagger. Again, this might be made up. Ant-Man and the Wasp. Movie's entirely forgettable. Now 2019. Captain Marvel. Mid. And later in 2019, Avengers Endgame. This is where I stopped watching. I very much enjoyed this movie, but I'll explain why this is my stopping point later on. Okay, I lied. I also watched Spider-Man Far From Home, but that's because it's Spider-Man, not because I was trying to keep up with the MCU. 2021, we have WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki, Black Widow, What If, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, Eternals, Hawkeye, and Spider-Man No Way Home, which, as I mentioned before, I did see because Spidey shoot web and me likey. 2022, Moon Knight, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Thor Love and Thunder, Miss Marvel, I Am Groot, and She-Hulk, with more on the way. If you got exhausted just listening to the timeline, I'm right there with you. That's a whole lot of content in a relatively short period of time. Which leads me to my first issue with the MCU. Back when this was all getting started, there was only 1 Marvel movie a year, 2 if you were lucky. That means whenever a Marvel movie came out, it was a big event that got everyone all hot and bothered. But the more Marvel content you release in a year, the less fun and exciting each subsequent release becomes. You dilute the market with so much superhero that superhero starts feeling boring and mundane. It's like Coachella. And hear me out. Many people, myself included, don't see the appeal of it, but clearly they've hit the nail on the head for their target demographic because over 100,000 people will show up every year to parade themselves around like they got entirely too drunk at a Renaissance festival. Now imagine if they started doing Coachella 3, 4, 5 times a year. Less and less people would show up each time because it feels less special. And the ones who do will be the most annoying and insufferable ones, because they take it entirely too seriously. Another way to think about it, and this one is probably more appropriate for the content of this video, would be if you saw a boring ass vanilla Clark Kent walk into a phone booth and emerge as Superman, you might actually wet your pants. But if you came to realize that he does that every Tuesday at 12 p.m., breaking the sound barrier and ruining your lunch break, the novelty would wear off and you'd just be upset that your ears were bleeding. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and the MCU crossed that line a long time ago. And for me, what set in was a phrase that I'm sure that you've heard of, which is Marvel fatigue. When there's a constant onslaught of superhero content getting thrown in your face, not just by the MCU, I might add, there's a good chance you'll start feeling tired of it. I become bored very easily, and my interests tend to change rapidly, so I can't sit here trying to keep up with all the MCU content that's considered canon. Sure, I can enjoy Spider-Man one day, but then the next I'll want to watch a show about funny British ghosts, and the next I'll want to watch a movie about a shell that makes me cry more than once. I guess I'm just quirky that way. I'm weird. I'm a weirdo. Anyway, my point is that when you have so many movies and shows being released that are connected in a shared universe, it feels overwhelming to try to keep up. Sure, you can watch a random one without seeing the others, and I'm sure you can have a fun time, but there will always be a moment where a character makes a joke referencing something from another movie, and the whole audience besides you laughs, and you'll spend the rest of the movie wondering what you were too stupid to understand. The fatigue for me set in right after Avengers Endgame, and in truth, it probably set in earlier than that, but I wanted to at least make it to Endgame because they'd been building to that for years, and if I wasn't going to stick around for that, then why the hell did I watch Iron Man 2? Endgame was built up as the final mission for all these characters we've been following for over a decade, and when all is said and done, I think it's a good conclusion. I felt a sense of accomplishment after I made it through the 3-hour runtime and thought I could close this cinematic chapter of my life. That's it. it's over. Now, I knew they were in the process of making more MCU content because I don't live under a rock, but this felt like the logical stopping point for me, so I looked myself in the mirror and said, that's it, I'm done. Except for Spidey. The MCU continuing after Endgame felt to me like when a TV show has reached its logical conclusion or just run out of ideas and they just keep going anyway. You know the kind of show I'm talking about. I don't think the MCU is out of ideas by any means, but I do think that they've jumped the shark, attached themselves to a rocket, and sent themselves careening into outer space. The point is, when it comes to Marvel, I'm so tired. Here's a segue to the next topic. There's a phenomenon that happened for a period of time with Marvel movies that I like to call the skim milk effect. As we all know, skim milk is just water pretending to be milk, and it's garbage. There was a time when Marvel would hire talented directors with their own unique whole milk style. Taika Waititi, Ryan Coogler, Scott Derrickson. Then they would water down that director's style until they found it suitable enough for a general audience, making the movie feel like a skim milk version of that director's vision. Put it another way, Fanta with pure cane sugar, LaCroix. Each one of these directors has other movies they've directed that I think are better than their Marvel contributions, and I feel like they have much more of their unique fingerprint on them. What We Do in the Shadows and Jojo Rabbit are both incredibly high quality and one-of-a-kind films, and Thor Ragnarok feels like they took Taika and turned his battery power to 25%. Creed is hands down one of the best Rocky installments, and Ryan Coogler pretty much single-handedly revived the franchise. Black Panther, while admittedly culturally significant, includes many aspects that feel as if a studio didn't let Coogler achieve his full vision. With The Black Phone, Scott Derrickson made one of the most fun and entertaining horror thrillers that I've seen in a very long time. Doctor Strange, on the other hand, is pretty unmemorable, except for this part that my siblings and I used to quote to each other relentlessly.
Teach me.
Now, I don't know all this for a fact because I don't know these people.
I don't even know who you are.
But the trend of talented directors making mid-movies, as the kids say, seems pretty apparent to me. And why do studios do this? Because they need to appeal to the widest base of moviegoers, so they make lowest common denominator movies. Instead of making a new and unique movie that one niche will absolutely love more than their own mother, but some other people won't like as much, let's just stamp out everything that makes the movie special and end up with a movie that everyone will find just okay. Studios would rather have most of the population at large think their movie is passable rather than take a gamble and make something that could potentially get mixed reactions, which is how we end up with so many movies that seem cookie cutter and like they copy and pasted an old script and just changed the names. If it worked once, let's just keep beating that dead horse until people stop shelling out money. And oh my god, I can't go on any longer without mentioning what I'm sure you already know. These movies have very bad humor. Marvel used to get flack for making their humor too Joss Whedon-y after the success of the Avengers, and that flack was warranted. Captain America saying language whenever somebody says pee-pee or poo-poo was just not funny. It's annoying. And I think Marvel realized that after a while because they moved away from this and even had Captain America make fun of himself in one of the movies, but the humor is still bad, just in a different way. For example, what are those? Let me be clear. The What Are Those videos aren't and never were funny. But it's even worse because by the time this movie came out, that joke was dead and buried. That's why you don't put internet trends like this or people dabbing in movies, which I wish someone would tell studio executives. It takes so long from the time a movie is written until it's released in theaters that any pop culture reference will undoubtedly feel dated and make the entire audience cringe. Here's another example of bad comedy.
We're going through the big one.
The devil's anus.
Come on, Taika, I know you're better than that. I feel like this is indicative of a common misconception about toilet humor. If American Vandal taught me anything, it's that poop is funny.
Poop is funny.
It's Always Sunny taught me the same thing. But poop and farts and butts can only be funny in the context you put them in. Bruce just saying the word for butthole isn't funny in and of itself, but apparently Marvel is marketed towards 8-year-olds.
Guys, we're coming up on the devil's anus.
He said anus. That means butthole. I could go on about bad humor in these movies, but you get the point. All these are reasons I gave up watching things from the MCU, but I did notice a different trend recently, which is why I also want to discuss Marvel's new phase. As I've mentioned more than once, the only things I've seen from Marvel's new phase are about Spider-Man, so much of this is going to be based on trailers I've seen and word of mouth from other people. Take Thor, Love and Thunder. I haven't seen it, but it has mixed reviews. And a lot of what I've heard is that Taika sometimes takes things too far, gets a little too Taika, which doesn't agree with everyone. But for people like my brother, they love it. And I can respect that much more than some old bland content that I'll forget about as soon as I exit the theater. It also seems that with Marvel shows on Disney Plus that they're starting to diversify their content, which is great, because then maybe it'll help different people find something they connect with more, even if the reviews are lukewarm. But it also means there are going to be more shows out there that I'll have no interest in watching, adding to my Marvel fatigue, so it's a double-edged sword.
Someone get his sword.
Like I said, I haven't seen those shows or movies, so this is all guesswork, but I do know about this. So it's good to see that their sense of humor has not improved, and I know which show not to watch. A few months ago, my siblings and I tried to figure out how many Marvel movies we like versus dislike, and using my scientific method, I came up with a hypothesis, which was that I thought a little less than half of the ones I'd seen would be ones I like. Lo and behold, I found that about 60% of them fell into that category, which surprised me. Then I dug a little deeper, and I found that this was due to something I like to call the Rotten Tomatoes effect. Rotten Tomatoes has warped the way we view movies, mostly in a bad way. It's still pretty useful, don't get me wrong. If I see that more than half of critics think that a movie's a stinker, I probably won't watch it. But with Rotten Tomatoes, there's no way to communicate that a movie is just okay. It's either plump ripe tomato or green splat. That leads to a dilemma I see often where a movie will have a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, but then if you look at the critic ratings individually, they'll say something like, this movie wasn't great, but at least the director didn't spit on me, 2.5 out of 5. And Rotten Tomatoes will count that as positive. And that's the same system I was using with the Marvel movies. If I could only choose between good and bad, I would throw a movie in good. Even if I didn't like it that much, I just didn't think it was terrible. When I broke down even further, I found that I only really liked about a handful of them, thought that many of them were in the middle of the road, and then there were a few that were terrible. I also found that the more time went on, the less movies I liked, probably because I was now a full-fledged adult when these movies came out, and they're made for children. That's another thing I think people should remember. These movies are mostly made for children, so let's not take them too seriously.
But apparently, Marvel is marketed towards 8-year-olds.
Just because I'm pretty over the MCU doesn't mean I think you have to be too. If you're a Marvel superfan who just can't wait for every release, then great. More power to you. If you watch one every now and then but skip others, awesome. If you're like me and only watch the Peter Parker Variety Hour, I think you're cool. It's entertainment, and with every form of media, we're not all going to agree. But if there's one thing we can agree on, it's that Thor 2 is terrible. Goodbye.